The ugly king's daughter married a prince against her father's will. When the royal ceremony ended, something happened that left everyone speechless. From the highest tower of Westland Castle, Princess Amber watched the world she was forbidden to join. Morning sunlight streamed through the narrow window, illuminating her face, half beautiful, half marked by the strange scars that had appeared mysteriously on her 3rd birthday. She traced them with her fingertips. Feeling their familiar ridges, these marks had sealed her fate. "Your Highness." A soft knock accompanied the gentle voice of Lady Agnes, her elderly lady-in-waiting. "May I come in?" "Of course, Agnes," Amber replied, turning from the window. Agnes entered, carrying a breakfast tray. Though well into her 70s, she moved with surprising grace. Her kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she set down the tray, then secured the door behind her. "The castle is buzzing today," Agnes whispered, her tone changing once they were alone. "The King's Council is meeting," Amber sighed. "Another discussion about the eastern borders. No doubt my father seems convinced East Haven is planning something." Agnes hesitated before answering. "Your father sees threats everywhere these days." She didn't need to say what they both knew, that King Harold had changed over the years, growing more paranoid, more cruel, and much of that change had coincided with the Countess Judith's rise to power as his most trusted advisor. "Did you bring it?" Amber asked eagerly. Agnes smiled, producing a worn leather book from her robes, philosophy from the Southern Isles. Quite forbidden, of course. These secret lessons were Amber's salvation, while her father believed she spent her days in mindless embroidery and prayer. Agnes had been educating her in history, languages, philosophy, and even the rudimentary elements of the old mystical arts that women once practiced openly before men had deemed such knowledge dangerous. "Thank you," Amber whispered, carefully hiding the book beneath her mattress with the others. "There's something else," Agnes said, her voice dropping further. The Countess was seen entering the king's chambers before dawn. Amber's stomach tightened. Judith's pre-dawn visits to her father always preceded some new cruelty. The Countess's hold over the king seemed to grow stronger each year, her whispers poisoning him against anyone she deemed a threat, especially his own daughter. "You think she's planning something?" Amber asked. "I fear so, child." Their conversation was interrupted by heavy footsteps approaching in the corridor outside. Amber quickly grabbed her embroidery frame as Agnes assumed a properly deferential posture. The door swung open without a knock. King Harold of Westland filled the doorway, his imposing frame draped in royal finery. Behind him, like a shadow made flesh, stood Countess Judith, her beauty cold and perfect, her dark eyes fixed on Amber with barely concealed disdain. "Father," Amber said, rising to curtsy. "What an unexpected honor." Harold didn't acknowledge the greeting. "The time has come for you to serve Westland," he announced without preamble. "You will marry the Duke of Northridge 1 month from today." The embroidery frame slipped from Amber's fingers, clattering to the floor. "The Duke of Northridge," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "But father, he's wealthy, powerful, and controls the northern gold mines we need," Harold interrupted. "His advanced age means you won't have to endure his company for many years before becoming a wealthy widow." Amber felt the blood drain from her face. The Duke was notorious, over 60, cruel to his servants, and having buried 3 wives already, rumors suggested none had died from natural causes. "Surely there are other alliances that would benefit Westland," Amber ventured carefully. The king's face darkened. "You think I haven't explored every option? That I enjoy marrying my only child, marked as she is, to an old man?" His gaze flickered to the scars on her face. "The Duke has generously overlooked your imperfections. You should be grateful." From behind him, Countess Judith stepped forward, her crimson dress rustling against the stone floor. "Your Majesty is being merciful, Princess. The Duke's eyesight is failing. A blessing for you both." Her smile never reached her eyes. "Besides, beauty fades, but gold mines are eternal." Amber held her tongue, knowing protest would only make matters worse. She could feel Agnes trembling beside her. "The arrangements are being made," Harold continued. "You'll be moved to the East Wing tomorrow to begin your bridal preparations. Lady Agnes will remain here." "But, Father, Agnes has been with me since—" "Enough!" Harold's shout echoed off the stone walls. "You'll have new ladies more fitting for a future duchess. This decision is final." As they turned to leave, Judith paused, her cold fingers brushing against Amber's scarred cheek. "Such a shame," she murmured. How the gods mark those who are unworthy. When the door slammed shut behind them, Amber collapsed onto her bed, her body shaking with silent sobs. Agnes rushed to her side. "They're separating us," Amber whispered. "She knows you're teaching me. She's always known." Agnes took Amber's hands in her own. "Listen carefully, child. We don't have much time, that man. The king." She hesitated, glancing nervously at the door. "There are things you don't know. Things I've waited too long to tell you." "What things?" Amber asked, wiping away tears. "Not here. Not now. The walls have ears that report to the Countess." Agnes pressed something into Amber's palm. "Hide this. When the time comes, it will guide you." Amber opened her hand to find a small iron key, ancient and oddly warm to the touch. "What does it open?" "The past," Agnes whispered, "and perhaps your future." That night, unable to sleep, Amber stood at her window watching distant torches flicker along the border river that separated Westland from East Haven. Beyond those waters lay another kingdom, another life she would never know. In her palm, the mysterious key seemed to pulse with faint warmth, as if alive. Something was coming, some change, some chance, perhaps some danger. For 20 years she had lived in the shadows, the scarred princess hidden away, the daughter her father couldn't bear to look upon. Now he would sell her to a cruel old man for gold and power. "I won't let that happen," she whispered to the night, her voice stronger than she expected. "Whatever secrets you're keeping, Agnes, whatever this key unlocks, I'll find a way." Below in the castle gardens, a solitary figure in a hooded cloak looked up toward Amber's tower window. Countess Judith's face was hidden in shadow, but her lips moved in silent incantation as her fingers traced arcane symbols in the night air. The scars on Amber's face began to burn. The clock was ticking. The wedding preparations would begin tomorrow, and somewhere across the river in East Haven, another destiny was unfolding, one that would collide with Amber's in ways no one could possibly imagine. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of East Haven like a lover reluctant to part. Prince Joshua stood at his chamber window, watching as the sun's first rays attempted to pierce the veil of fog shrouding the border river. Beyond those waters lay Westland, the kingdom his advisors insisted was responsible for his father's death 20 years ago. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice spoke from the doorway. "Even with all its shadows." Joshua turned to see his mother, Queen Dowager Madeline, standing in the entryway. Her appearances were so rare these days that each one felt like an event. Though nearing 50, she remained striking, her silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes commanding attention despite her slender frame. "I didn't expect you this morning," Joshua said, bowing slightly. "The council meeting concerns me," she replied, gliding into the room. "They're pushing for military action against Westland again," Joshua sighed. "Lord Blackwood insists King Harold is mobilizing troops along our western border. And do you believe him?" "I don't know what to believe anymore." Joshua ran a hand through his dark hair. 20 years of suspicion and accusations. Yet we're no closer to proving Harold had anything to do with Father's death. Madeline moved to the window beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant border. "Revenge served cold requires patience, my son." There was something in her tone that made Joshua study her face. His mother had changed after his father's death, retreating from public life, speaking less, watching more. The vibrant woman from his childhood memories had become an enigma, emerging from her private chambers, only for matters of utmost importance. "You've never told me exactly what happened that day," he said carefully. "In the hunting party?" Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Some wounds are too deep to reopen, even after 20 years. A knock at the door interrupted them. Captain Elliot, Joshua's most trusted guard and childhood friend, entered and bowed deeply. "Forgive the intrusion, your majesties. The council awaits." Joshua nodded. "We'll be there momentarily." When Elliot had gone, Madeline placed a hand on her son's arm. "Before we join them, have you considered my suggestion about visiting the border villages?" "To go in disguise," Joshua raised an eyebrow. "The council would never approve, which is precisely why I suggested it." A rare smile crossed her face. A prince who only sees his kingdom from behind castle walls will never truly understand it. And understanding East Haven means understanding its people, especially those who live in the shadow of our enemy. "You think I'll learn something about Westland?" "I think you'll learn something about yourself," she answered cryptically. "Sometimes the truth we seek lies not in grand councils or ancient documents, but in the simplest of encounters." The council chamber buzzed with tense voices when they arrived. 12 men seated around a massive oak table fell silent as Joshua and his mother entered. The prince took his place at the head, while Madeline chose to stand by the window, slightly removed from the proceedings. Lord Blackwood, a stocky man with a perpetual scowl, was the first to speak. "Your Highness, our scouts report unusual movement near the Westland fortress at Raven's Pass. King Harold appears to be gathering forces. How reliable is this information?" Joshua asked. "I've seen the reports myself," said Lord Norwood, the elderly military commander. "But we've had false alarms before. Harold's movements often seem threatening until we discover he's merely conducting training exercises. Or deliberately provoking us," countered Blackwood. "We should position troops as a warning." Joshua studied the map spread across the table. "The last 3 times we've mobilized based on similar reports, nothing came of it except wasted resources and heightened tensions. And what if we're wrong this time?" Blackwood pressed. "Your father trusted Harold once, and that's enough." Joshua cut him off sharply. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The assassination of King Thomas during a joint hunting expedition with Harold of Westland remained a wound that had never properly healed in East Haven, though no direct evidence linked Harold to the king's death. The circumstances were suspicious enough that relations between the kingdoms had deteriorated into cold hostility. From her position by the window, Queen Madeline finally spoke. "Perhaps we might benefit from more reliable information before committing to any action." All eyes turned to her. She rarely contributed to council discussions. "What do you suggest, Mother?" Joshua asked. "Send someone to the border villages. Someone who can listen without being recognized. Someone who can see with clear eyes, unburdened by old hatreds." Lord Blackwood scoffed. "A spy, Your Majesty. An observer," she corrected. "Someone whose judgment I trust implicitly." Joshua realized she was still pushing her earlier suggestion. He considered it for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll go myself." The council erupted in protests. "Your Highness, that's far too dangerous. If Harold's agents were to recognize you, the risk is unacceptable." Joshua raised a hand for silence. "I'll travel as James, a knight's squire. Captain Elliot will accompany me with a small guard disguised as merchants." He traced the river on the map. "We'll visit the 3 main border villages, starting with Riverford. I'll return in 2 weeks with a first-hand assessment." Lord Norwood sighed. "Your father had the same stubborn streak, always wanting to see things for himself. And had he been less trusting," Lord Blackwood muttered, "he might still be alive." Later that evening, Joshua prepared for his journey in his chambers. Captain Elliot inspected their plain traveling clothes and weathered leather armor, nothing that would betray their royal connection. "The council is still fuming," Elliot reported with a slight grin. "Lord Blackwood was practically purple by the time I left." Joshua shrugged. "They'll recover. This journey is necessary. May I speak freely?" When Joshua nodded, Elliot continued. "This feels like more than just border reconnaissance. What are you really hoping to find out there?" Joshua paused in his packing. "My father died when I was 7, Elliot. All I have are fragments of memories and tales told by others. For 20 years, I've been taught to hate Westland, to suspect King Harold of murder without proof. Before I commit our kingdom to actions that could lead to war, I need to see the border for myself, to understand." A soft knock interrupted them. The door opened to reveal Queen Madeline, holding a small leather pouch. "For your journey," she said, handing it to Joshua. The pouch contained a simple silver pendant inscribed with unfamiliar symbols. "An old family protection. Wear it when you cross the river." Joshua slipped it around his neck. "You've always been against confrontation with Westland." "Why?" Madeline's expression became distant. "Hatred is easy to kindle but difficult to extinguish. Whatever happened to your father, there are layers of truth beneath the official story that even I don't fully understand." She cupped his cheek with her cool palm. "Be careful, but be open. The answers you seek may come in unexpected forms." After she left, Elliot raised an eyebrow. "The queen grows more mysterious with age." "She does," Joshua agreed, tucking the pendant beneath his simple traveler's shirt. "But her instincts have never led me astray." As dawn broke the next morning, the small party of disguised royal guards rode out through the east gate of the castle. Prince Joshua, now just James, a humble squire, felt a strange lightness as they headed toward the border river that separated him from the kingdom he had been raised to distrust. Something was waiting for him there, some truth, some revelation, perhaps some danger, whatever it was. He could feel his destiny pulling him inexorably toward Westland, like the river current flowing between 2 lands that were more connected than either would care to admit. Amber slipped through the servants' corridor, her heart pounding against her ribs. 3 days had passed since her father's announcement, and preparations for her dreaded wedding were already underway. Seamstresses had been summoned, jewels inventoried, and negotiations with the Duke's representatives had begun. Worse still, Agnes had been reassigned to the northern tower, effectively separating them as the king had threatened. Today, however, Amber had seized an unexpected opportunity. The castle buzzed with preparations for a visiting dignitary, creating enough chaos for her to steal away unnoticed. Beneath her simple brown cloak, she wore a plain dress borrowed from a kitchen maid, nothing that would mark her as royalty. The iron key Agnes had given her hung on a cord around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes. Whatever secret it unlocked would have to wait. Today, Amber needed something else. One last taste of freedom before her life was sealed away forever. She slipped through the postern gate while the guards were distracted, her face partially concealed by a makeshift veil that covered her scarred cheek. The disguise was simple but effective. In Westland, the princess was rarely seen in public. Few would recognize her without her royal finery, especially with half her face covered. The path to the river wound through a small forest that marked the border between castle grounds and common land. Amber breathed deeply, savoring the earthy scent of moss and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. How different this felt from the stifling air of the castle. The border river came into view as she emerged from the tree line, a glittering ribbon separating Westland from East Haven. Local farmers and traders frequently crossed at shallow points, making it a neutral ground of sorts despite the tension between kingdoms. Amber found a quiet spot downstream from the main crossing, sitting on a sun-warmed rock to watch the water flow. On the opposite bank, East Haven's rolling hills rose toward distant mountains. She wondered what life was like there, under the rule of the young Prince Joshua and his reclusive mother. Her thoughts were interrupted by a child's scream. Amber jumped to her feet, scanning the riverbank. Upstream, a small figure thrashed in the current. A young boy, no more than 6 or 7, being pulled toward deeper water. Without hesitation, Amber threw off her cloak and waded in. The water was colder than she expected, shocking her skin as she pushed forward. The current tugged at her dress, threatening to pull her off balance. But she pressed on, moving diagonally across the flow as Agnes had once taught her. "Hold on," she called. "I'm coming." The boy's terrified eyes locked onto hers just before his head slipped beneath the surface. Amber lunged forward, plunging her arms into the churning water. Her fingers brushed fabric, then closed around a small wrist. With a strength born of desperation, she pulled the child up, cradling him against her chest as she fought the current back toward shore. When her feet finally found purchase on the rocky riverbed, Amber staggered toward the bank, the boy coughing and sputtering in her arms. She collapsed onto the grassy shore, gasping for breath. That was incredibly brave. Amber looked up, startled. A young man stood a few paces away, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and concerned eyes. She hadn't noticed him before and wondered how long he'd been watching. "I didn't think," she said, helping the boy sit up. "I just reacted." The man knelt beside them, offering a water skin. "Sometimes our truest selves emerge when we don't have time to think." His accent was different. "East Haven," she realized with a jolt. The boy coughed up more water, then began crying. I was just trying to catch a frog," he sobbed. A woman came running from the nearby village, crying out the boy's name. She swept him into her arms, alternating between scolding and thanking God for his safety. "Your son is safe," Amber assured her, keeping her veil carefully in place. "The current is stronger than it looks." The woman clutched her child tighter. "How can I repay you?" "No need," Amber said quickly. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," the stranger interjected, his eyes never leaving Amber's face. "Most would have called for help rather than risking themselves." The woman nodded vigorously. "He's right. You're an angel sent from heaven." She fumbled with a small pouch at her waist. "Please, at least take this. Truly, I want nothing," Amber insisted gently. "Just be careful near the river." After more profuse thanks, the woman carried her son back toward the village, leaving Amber alone with the mysterious man, uncomfortably aware of her soaking dress and half-concealed face. She reached for her discarded cloak. "Here, allow me." He retrieved it, offering it with a slight bow that seemed almost habitual. "Thank you." She hesitated, suddenly conscious of how improper it was to be alone with a stranger, especially one from East Haven. "James," he supplied. "I'm a squire traveling with merchants." He gestured vaguely toward the crossing point upstream. "And you are—" "Sarah," she lied, giving the first name that came to mind. "I work for a merchant in the city." She wrapped the cloak tightly around herself, shivering slightly. "You're cold. There's a clearing nearby with good sunlight. Perhaps you could dry off a bit before returning home." Amber knew she should refuse. She should hurry back to the castle before her absence was discovered, yet something in James's open expression made her hesitate. When would she ever have such a chance again? After the wedding, she would be the Duke's property, never to know freedom or genuine conversation again. Lead the way, she decided. The clearing was a small meadow dotted with wildflowers, hidden from the path by a stand of willows. Amber sat on a fallen log while James built a small fire with practiced efficiency. "You don't move like a squire," she observed as warmth began spreading from the flames. He looked up, surprised. "And you don't talk like a merchant's servant." Their eyes met across the fire, a silent acknowledgement of secrets kept, yet neither pressed for truth. Instead, they talked. Of simple things at first, then deeper matters. Books they'd read, ideas about justice and governance, dreams of what the world could be. Amber found herself speaking freely, as she never had before, careful only to avoid details that might reveal her identity. "You have unusual thoughts for a squire," she said when he spoke passionately about how rulers should listen more to common people. "And you have uncommon wisdom for a merchant's assistant," he countered with a smile that transformed his serious face. Hours passed like minutes. The sun began its westward descent, reminding Amber that her absence would soon be noted. "I should go," she said reluctantly, rising to her feet. "Will you come here again?" James asked, his voice carefully casual. "I'm in the area for several days." Amber hesitated. Every instinct warned against it, yet the prospect of another afternoon of freedom, of conversation with someone who saw her as a person rather than a scarred princess or political pawn, was too tempting to resist. "Tomorrow," she heard herself say. "Same time." As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Sarah, your veil, it doesn't matter to me. What you did today speaks more of who you are than any appearance could." Amber froze, her hand instinctively rising to the cloth covering her scarred cheek. Had he glimpsed her face during the rescue? Did he somehow know who she was? "Thank you," she managed to say. "Until tomorrow, then." She hurried away, her mind racing. Only when she reached the edge of the forest did she glance back. James still stood in the clearing, watching her go, his tall figure backlit by the setting sun. For the first time in years, Amber felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope, not for escape from her fate. That seemed impossible, but for one brief, shining interlude of genuine connection before her prison door closed forever. What she couldn't know was that across the clearing, Prince Joshua of Easthaven was harboring similar thoughts, equally unaware that he had just spent the afternoon with the daughter of his kingdom's greatest enemy. For 2 weeks, Amber and James met at their secret clearing by the river. Each day brought new revelations, shared stories, dreams, and philosophies exchanged across the small fire he always built for her. For the first time in her life, Amber experienced what it meant to be seen for her mind, rather than her face or title. "You're different today," James observed during their latest meeting. Troubled, Amber stared into the flames. "My time here is running short. There's something happening in my household that I can't avoid." The wedding preparations had accelerated. Her prison walls were closing in. James moved to sit beside her on the log. "Is there anything I can do?" His proximity sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Over their meetings, something had grown between them, something neither acknowledged but both felt intensely. "No," she said softly. "Some fates can't be escaped." "I don't believe that." His voice gained a passionate edge. "We make our own destinies. Even the most powerful chains can be broken with enough courage." She smiled sadly behind her veil. "You sound like a philosopher, not a squire. And you sound like someone raised in courts, not markets." The observation hung in the air between them. They had maintained their aliases through each meeting, but the cracks in their disguises were widening. Amber felt a sudden urge to tell him everything, about the king, the countess, the forced marriage, the scars, to show her face and have done with pretense. Before she could speak, shouts erupted from the direction of the river crossing. "Stay here," James said. Instantly alert, he moved toward the tree line with the practiced caution of someone trained in combat, not service. Amber ignored his instruction, following close behind. Through the branches, they saw a group of Westland soldiers confronting Easthaven merchants at the crossing. The guards were searching wagons, accusations flying. "They're looking for something," she whispered. Or someone. James's face had gone rigid. We should leave now. They retreated deeper into the forest, taking a roundabout path away from the commotion. Amber noticed how James constantly scanned their surroundings, his hand habitually resting where a sword would hang. "You're not really a squire, are you?" she finally asked. He hesitated, then sighed. "No, and I suspect you're not a merchant's assistant." They reached a small stream feeding into the main river, hidden by dense foliage. James stopped, turning to face her fully. "I think it's time for truth between us," he said. "These past 2 weeks have meant more to me than you know. I've never met anyone who understands the world the way you do, who dreams of the same kind of justice and compassion." Amber's heart raced. The truth might change everything, or it might change nothing that matters. He reached for her hand, his touch sending sparks up her arm. "Who you are, your heart, your mind. I know that already. Names and titles are just trappings." Something in his words gave her courage. Slowly, Amber reached up and removed the veil that had hidden half her face during all their meetings. James didn't gasp or recoil as so many had before. His eyes traced the pattern of scars thoughtfully, then returned to meet her gaze. "Thank you for trusting me. There's more," she whispered, feeling as though she stood on a precipice. "My name isn't Sarah. A crashing sound in the underbrush interrupted her. They both spun toward the noise as a man in Westland royal livery burst into the clearing. "Princess Amber," the guard exclaimed, his eyes widening at the sight of her standing with a stranger. "Thank the gods we found you. The king has the entire castle searching." He broke off, finally registering James's presence. His hand went to his sword. "Step away from her, Highness." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Princess?" James went completely still, his expression shifting from confusion to shock as he stared at Amber. "Princess? Amber? King Harold's daughter?" The guard drew his sword. "Identify yourself, stranger." "Wait." Amber stepped between them. "He's a friend. There's no danger here. Your Highness. You've been missing for hours. The Countess raised the alarm when you weren't in your chambers for your wedding dress fitting." The guard kept his sword pointed at James. "I must insist you return immediately." Amber turned to James, whose face had gone pale. "I can explain. Princess Amber of Westland," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Daughter of King Harold." "Yes, but it's not what you think. I never meant to." "Princess." 3 more guards burst into the clearing. "Step away from that man immediately." James backed away, hands raised. "I'm unarmed. I mean no harm." The first guard grabbed Amber's arm. "We must return you to the castle." "Your Highness, the king is beside himself." "James, please," Amber implored, as the guards began pulling her away. "Meet me again tomorrow. I'll explain everything." His face had become an unreadable mask. "I don't think that would be wise, Princess." The way he said her title felt like a shard of ice in her heart. As the guards escorted her toward the castle, Amber fought back tears. She'd known this couldn't last. That discovery was inevitable. Yet watching the warmth drain from James's eyes had hurt more than she'd imagined possible. What she couldn't have known was that James had his own devastating realization. Prince Joshua of East Haven stood frozen in the clearing long after she'd disappeared, grappling with the fact that he'd fallen in love with the daughter of the man suspected of murdering his father. "How could you be so reckless?" King Harold's voice echoed off the stone walls of the throne room. "Sneaking out like a common thief, consorting with strangers at the border." Amber stood before him, still in her damp, muddy dress. Countess Judith watched from beside the throne, her cold eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I needed air, father. A moment of peace before you fulfill your duty," the king snapped. "The duty I've arranged to secure our kingdom's future. The Duke's representatives arrive tomorrow, and I find my daughter rolling in the mud with peasants." "I saved a drowning child," Amber said, lifting her chin. "I did nothing to shame you." Harold waved dismissively. "That guard says you were with a man. Alone. Unchaperoned. A traveler who showed me kindness. Nothing improper occurred." Countess Judith stepped forward, her crimson dress rustling. "Your Majesty, if I may, the princess clearly cannot be trusted with her own virtue. Perhaps stricter confinement until the wedding would be wise." "No," Amber protested. "Father, please." "Silence." Harold rose from his throne. "You will be confined to your chambers with guards at your door. Lady Agnes is permanently reassigned to the northern provinces. The wedding will proceed in 2 weeks' time." Amber felt the floor shift beneath her. "You're sending Agnes away." "Agnes?" She served our family for 3 generations, and her influence has clearly undermined your obedience," Judith interjected smoothly. "The king has been too lenient." Harold nodded. "Take her to her chambers. Double the guard." As soldiers gripped her arms, Amber made one last plea. "Father, please don't do this. Don't send me to a man who will secure our northern border and fill our treasury with gold," Harold finished coldly. "Your comfort is secondary to Westland's security. Remember your place, daughter." Later, locked in her chambers with guards outside her door, Amber pressed her forehead against the cool window glass. The river gleamed like silver in the moonlight, marking the border between kingdoms, and between her past and future, she touched the iron key that still hung around her neck, its mystery now seemingly irrelevant. What did ancient secrets matter when her life was ending? Tomorrow Agnes would be gone. In 2 weeks, she would be the Duke's property, and James, whoever he truly was, she had lost him too. The look in his eyes when he'd learned her identity haunted her, not fear or disgust at her scars, but something worse, betrayal. What Amber couldn't know was that across the river, Prince Joshua paced his chamber in the East Haven hunting lodge, wrestling with an impossible choice. The mysterious woman who had captured his heart was Princess Amber of Westland, the daughter of his father's suspected murderer. The princess whispered to be hideously disfigured, the political pawn being married off to cement Harold's northern alliance. Nothing was as he had believed. Not the princess, not himself, and perhaps, he realized with growing certainty, not the truth about his father's death either. Dawn had barely broken over East Haven Castle when Prince Joshua's party returned. He rode directly to the stables, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. Captain Elliot hurried after him, concern etched on his weathered face. "Your Highness," Elliot called, "the council will want an immediate report." Joshua barely heard him. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Amber, her intelligence, her courage saving the drowning child, the unexpected beauty of her scarred face and her true identity. "Princess of Westland, daughter of King Harold, summon the council," Joshua finally responded. "1 hour, and what shall I tell them we discovered?" Joshua paused, one hand on the stable door. "Tell them we found something unexpected, something that changes everything." Queen Dowager Madeline was waiting in his chambers. Seated by the window as if she'd been there for hours, she rose as he entered, studying his face with her penetrating gaze. "You met someone," she stated simply. Joshua stopped short. "How could you possibly—" "A mother knows." She approached, touching the pendant she'd given him that now hung outside his shirt. "And this was warm when you returned. It responds to significant encounters." He sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I met Princess Amber of Westland." If Madeline was shocked, she hid it well. Only a slight widening of her eyes betrayed any surprise. "Harold's daughter, the one they keep hidden away." "Yes." Except she wasn't hidden. She was at the river disguised as a commoner. He described their meetings, the drowning child, their conversations, and the final revelation of her identity. "She has no idea who I really am," he finished. "She only knows me as James, a squire." Madeline listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she asked, "These scars of hers, what did they look like?" The question seemed odd, but Joshua described the pattern. Curved marks, like crescent moons, along the left side of her face from temple to jaw. They seemed almost deliberate, not like an accident or disease. Something flickered in his mother's eyes. Recognition, alarm. She turned away too quickly for him to be certain. "The council will urge caution," she said. "They'll remind you of your father's fate after trusting Harold." "I know," Joshua sighed, "but she's nothing like her father. She's kind, thoughtful, passionate about justice. She saved that child without hesitation, risking her own safety." "You care for her," Madeline observed quietly. "I do, more than I should, given who she is." He ran a hand through his hair. "And now she's being forced to marry some northern duke, an old man who's already buried 3 wives. Madeline's head snapped up. "When? Soon?" "Within weeks, from what I gathered." She paced the room, her usual composure visibly disturbed. "This changes matters. Mother," she faced him directly, "follow your heart, Joshua, but proceed with extreme caution. The game being played is older and more dangerous than you realize." The council chamber erupted into chaos when Joshua finished speaking. "Absolutely not." Lord Blackwood slammed his fist on the table. "Have you lost your mind? It's political suicide, added Lord Norwood, and likely a trap. Joshua stood firm at the head of the table. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you of my decision. He had just announced his intention to formally request Princess Amber's hand in marriage, to seek a union between East Haven and Westland, rather than continuing decades of cold hostility. Your father's body wasn't even cold before Harold consolidated power, Blackwood argued. And now you want to marry his daughter? The princess is not her father, Joshua countered, and this marriage could bring peace to both kingdoms, or deliver you into the same trap that killed King Thomas, Norwood warned. How convenient that Harold's hidden daughter appears alone at the border, befriends you, and steals your heart just when she's being married off to strengthen Westland's northern defenses. Joshua's temper flared. You speak as if you know her. You don't. I do. You know a disguise, Blackwood scoffed. A performance. Gentlemen? Queen Madeline's voice cut through the argument as she rose from her seat in the corner. The prince has made his decision. All eyes turned to her in surprise. She rarely intervened in council matters, and never to support risky endeavors. Your Majesty, Blackwood began. Surely you of all people, I of all people, she interrupted, understand that hatred perpetuates itself until someone has the courage to break the cycle. She moved to stand beside her son. Send the emissaries, make the formal request. The council sat in stunned silence. There's more at stake here than any of you realize, she continued. Forces have been in motion for decades. Perhaps this is where they were always meant to lead. Joshua stared at his mother, wondering at her cryptic words and unexpected support. Since his father's death, she had counseled patience and restraint. This sudden endorsement of such a bold move seemed out of character. After the council reluctantly agreed to prepare a formal embassy to Westland, Joshua found himself alone with his mother in the antechamber. Thank you, he said, though I'm surprised by your support. She touched his face gently. There are times to wait, and times to act decisively. The timing of this? It's significant. How so? Her eyes took on that distant look he'd seen increasingly in recent years, as if she were seeing beyond the present moment to something only she could perceive. The Northridge alliance would be disastrous, she said, not just for the princess, but for both our kingdoms. Some chains, once forged, cannot be broken for generations. Before he could press for clarification, she continued, have the emissaries emphasized the economic benefits, joint access to the river trade, mutual defense against the northern tribes, and if Harold refuses, her expression hardened. Then we move to the second approach, though I pray it won't be necessary. Amber stood motionless as seamstresses pinned the wedding gown around her, heavy cream-colored silk embroidered with gold thread, a prison disguised as finery. Through her window, she could see the carriage that would take Agnes away to the northern provinces. Being loaded with the old woman's meager possessions, a tear slipped down her cheek. Careful with those pins, snapped Countess Judith, who supervised the fitting. The Duke is paying a king's ransom for this alliance. The least we can provide is a bride who isn't bleeding on her gown. How fortunate for the Duke that his eyesight is failing, Amber said bitterly. Otherwise, he might see what he's actually getting. Judith smiled coldly. Indeed, though I suspect he cares less about your face and more about producing an heir before he dies. Let's hope you're more fertile than you are beautiful. A commotion outside interrupted the fitting raised voices, the clatter of horses. Judith moved to the window. Interesting, she murmured. East Haven colors. Amber's heart leapt. James. No, whoever he truly was. Had he come for her? What is it? She asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Emissaries from Prince Joshua, Judith replied, watching the arrival. How peculiar. We've had no formal communication with East Haven in years. An hour later, King Harold's roar of rage could be heard throughout the castle. Amber, back in her chambers after the fitting, pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear the guard's conversation. Never seen him so angry, one whispered. Can you blame him? The Prince of East Haven asking for the princess's hand? After what his father did to our king, Amber's knees weakened. Prince Joshua. James was Prince Joshua of East Haven, and he was asking to marry her. Later that evening, her door burst open as King Harold stormed in, his face mottled with fury. Countess Judith followed like a shadow. Did you know? He demanded. Did you plan this during your little escapades to the river? Plan what, father? Amber asked, though her racing heart told her exactly what he meant. Prince Joshua of East Haven has formally requested your hand in marriage, claims it would bring peace between our kingdoms. Harold's eyes narrowed. His eyes. The same prince who, coincidentally, has been traveling incognito along our borders recently. Amber struggled to maintain composure. I didn't know. Liar. He grabbed her arm roughly. You've been conspiring with our enemies. No. I met a man named James. I had no idea he was... Enough. Harold released her with a shove. I've refused the offer, of course. The Duke arrives tomorrow, and you will receive him properly. Father, please. The discussion is ended. He turned to leave, then paused. One more attempt to undermine me, and I'll have you locked in the North Tower until your wedding day. Am I clear? After they left, Amber sank onto her bed, mind reeling. James was Prince Joshua. He knew who she was now, and still he wanted her enough to formalize a request for marriage, to risk rejection and political embarrassment. For the first time since the guards had dragged her back to the castle, hope flickered in her heart. It was a desperate, fragile thing, but it was there. Across the river in East Haven, Prince Joshua received his father's old captain, who had delivered Harold's contemptuous refusal. He threatened war if we pursue this, the man reported grimly. Joshua's jaw tightened. Then we moved to the second approach. As the Queen suggested, Captain Elliot shifted uncomfortably. A rescue, Your Highness. That's an act of war itself. Not a rescue, Joshua corrected, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of Westland Castle. An invitation. The princess will decide her own fate. The Duke of Northridge arrived with a retinue befitting his station. 30 mounted knights, twice as many servants, and 6 wagons loaded with wedding gifts that Amber recognized for what they truly were. Payment for her body and her bloodline. The man himself matched his reputation. Tall and skeletal with yellowing teeth and rheumy eyes that squinted constantly, struggling to see clearly despite the bright afternoon sun. Standing beside her father in the castle courtyard, Amber maintained the perfect posture and blank expression expected of a royal bride. Inside, she felt nothing but cold dread. Your Majesty, the Duke wheezed, bowing to King Harold before turning to Amber. And the lovely princess, the rumors of your appearance have been greatly exaggerated. She forced a smile, aware of her father's warning glare. You honor me, Your Grace. The Duke's papery fingers closed around her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. I look forward to knowing you better, my dear. We leave for Northridge immediately after the wedding ceremony. Amber's stomach clenched. She had expected at least a brief period at home before being spirited away to the Duke's remote northern castle. So soon? She asked, trying to keep the panic from her voice. I've been without a duchess for too long, he said, his gaze crawling over her body. My household requires a woman's touch. My daughter will make you an excellent wife, King Harold interjected, though perhaps a brief adjustment period at Westland would... Unnecessary, the Duke interrupted. The northern passes will begin to snow soon. We must reach Northridge while the roads remain passable. Amber nodded mechanically, feeling herself shrinking inside with each passing moment. The Duke's castle was notoriously isolated, perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the northern sea. Once there, she would effectively disappear from the world. That evening, a grand feast welcomed the Duke and his entourage. Seated beside her betrothed, Amber picked at her food while enduring his clammy hand on her arm, his stale breath in her ear as he described the improvements he'd made to his castle in anticipation of her arrival. I've had the old Duchess's chambers completely refurbished, he told her. The previous furnishings held too many unfortunate memories. Amber suppressed a shudder, wondering what had happened to his previous wives in those chambers. Across the great hall, she caught sight of Countess Judith watching them with a satisfied smile, as if savoring Amber's discomfort. When the meal finally concluded, Amber excused herself, claiming fatigue. The Duke's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but he allowed her to withdraw with a warning. Rest well, my dear. Only 3 days until you are mine. In the relative safety of her chambers, Amber pressed her forehead against the cool stone wall, fighting back tears. She couldn't do this, couldn't marry this man, couldn't let him touch her, couldn't spend the rest of her life imprisoned in his northern fortress. A soft knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, expecting a servant, she instead found a cloaked figure who slipped inside before the guards could notice. Agnes, Amber gasped, embracing her old nurse. How did you... Shh, Agnes warned, glancing at the door. I bribed a kitchen boy to create a distraction. We don't have much time. The old woman looked thinner, her face more lined than Amber remembered, though they'd been separated only a week. I thought you'd been sent north already. I was on the road when a messenger intercepted me. Agnes explained, producing a small package wrapped in oilcloth from beneath her cloak. From the Queen of East Haven. Amber's breath caught. Queen Madeline, Prince Joshua's mother. Agnes's expression sharpened. You know of the prince. We met, though I didn't know who he was then. He's asked for my hand in marriage. The old blood calls to old blood, Agnes murmured cryptically. She pressed the package into Amber's hands. This belongs to you. It should have been given to you years ago, but the time wasn't right. Amber unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal an ornate medallion on a silver chain. It was beautiful. Ancient silver work encircling a central stone that seemed to shift between blue and green depending on how the light struck it. What is it? She asked, tracing the intricate symbols etched around the edge. Open it, Agnes urged. Amber found the tiny hinge and carefully opened the medallion. Inside was a miniature portrait of a beautiful young woman with a striking resemblance to herself, the same high cheekbones, the same curve of the lips, but without the scars that marked Amber's face. She looks like me, Amber whispered. She was your mother, Agnes said softly. My mother, but she died when I was born. Father never kept any portraits, because that woman was not his wife. Agnes took Amber's hands, her eyes intense. The woman in that portrait was the true princess of Westland. Sister to Queen Madeline of East Haven, she was married to the rightful heir of Westland before Harold seized power. Amber stared at her nurse in shock. What are you saying? That King Harold is not your father, child. You are the daughter of Princess Eleanor of Westland and Prince Rowan, Harold's cousin, the true heir to the throne before Harold arranged their deaths. The room seemed to spin around Amber. No, this can't be. I've lived in this castle my entire life. Father, Harold, he's always acknowledged me as his daughter. As a cover for his crimes, Agnes explained urgently. I was lady-in-waiting to your true mother the night Harold's men attacked. I managed to save you, just a babe of 3 months. When I tried to flee the castle, we were intercepted. Harold was about to have you killed when Countess Judith suggested a different approach. Judith. Amber's hand went to her scarred cheek. She did this to me. Agnes nodded grimly. She cursed you with those marks when you were 3 years old, claiming they were a sign from the gods that you were unfit to rule. It served Harold's purpose perfectly. He could appear merciful by raising his marked daughter, while actually keeping the true heir powerless and hidden away. Amber sank onto her bed, clutching the medallion. Does Prince Joshua know this? His mother has begun to tell him. Though not all, there are deeper secrets still. Agnes glanced nervously at the door. The medallion contains powerful protection magic. It belonged to your mother, and her mother before her. The women of your bloodline have always possessed certain gifts. The scars, Amber realized, they burn sometimes, especially when Judith is near. Your body recognizing the source of the curse, Agnes nodded. The magic that marked you also bound your true abilities, keeping them dormant. A sudden commotion in the corridor made them both freeze. Agnes moved swiftly to the window, checking the distance to the ground. I must go. Guards are changing shifts. Wait, Amber clutched her arm. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? I'm to be married in 3 days. Prince Joshua is coming for you, Agnes whispered. The Queen has foreseen it. When he does, you must go with him to the old chapel in the borderlands. The ruins. Why? Because that's where your parents were truly married, binding the bloodlines of both kingdoms. Agnes cupped Amber's scarred cheek. The magic that cursed you can only be broken where the blessing of your parents' union was first given. She moved toward the window, then turned back. Wear the medallion against your skin. It will help shield your thoughts from Judith. Trust no one except the prince. She slipped a tiny vial into Amber's hand. And if capture seems inevitable, drink this. It will make you appear dead for 3 days, long enough for them to abandon the pursuit. With surprising agility for her age, Agnes climbed onto the windowsill. A rope Amber hadn't noticed before hung down into the darkness. Agnes, Amber called softly. If Harold isn't my father, who am I? The old woman's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. You are Amber, rightful Queen of Westland, daughter of Eleanor, niece to Queen Madeline, and the last hope for both our kingdoms. Then she was gone, descending into the night, leaving Amber alone with a medallion containing her true mother's face and a truth that changed everything she had ever believed about herself. She closed the locket and slipped its chain around her neck, feeling its weight against her skin, the weight of her true heritage. For the first time, the scars on her face felt not like a shameful mark, but like a battle wound, evidence of how much her enemies had feared her, even as an infant. 3 days, she whispered to herself, clutching the medallion. If you're coming for me, Joshua, it must be soon. Across the river in East Haven, Prince Joshua was already making his preparations, unaware that the woman he sought to rescue was far more important to both kingdoms than either of them had realized. The night before her wedding, Amber stood at her window watching distant torches mark the boundary between Westland and East Haven. Her fingers absently traced the medallion hidden beneath her nightdress, its weight both comforting and unsettling against her skin. 2 days had passed since Agnes's visit, and she'd heard nothing from Prince Joshua. Perhaps he wasn't coming after all. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She quickly tucked the medallion out of sight before opening the door, expecting a servant with final wedding preparations. Instead, Countess Judith glided in, dismissing the guards with a wave of her hand. "Princess," she said with a cold smile, "I thought we might have a final conversation before tomorrow's celebration." Amber maintained a neutral expression, conscious of Agnes's warning to guard her thoughts around the Countess. "You honor me with your concern." Judith circled the room, running her fingers along Amber's possessions, as if inspecting for dust. "The Duke has quite a reputation, you know. His last wife lived barely a year before falling down a rather convenient staircase." "Why are you telling me this?" Amber asked. Though she knew perfectly well, Judith was savoring her fear. Call it womanly advice. The Countess picked up Amber's bridal headdress, examining its jewels. "Submit completely. Don't resist him. Men like the Duke resent any display of will from their wives." "I'll keep that in mind," Amber replied stiffly. Judith approached, her dark eyes studying Amber's face with unusual intensity. "You seem different these past days, more composed than I would expect from a bride being sent to such a fate." Amber felt a strange warmth emanating from the medallion against her chest, as if it were responding to Judith's presence. She forced herself to maintain eye contact despite an instinctive urge to retreat. "I've accepted my duty to Westland," she said. "Have you?" Judith's cold fingers touched Amber's scarred cheek. "These marks were meant to be a reminder of your place, a visible warning to others about defying natural order." The medallion grew warmer. Amber resisted the urge to touch it, to ensure it remained hidden. "Natural order?" she asked, playing for time. "What do you mean?" Something shifted in Judith's expression, a momentary slip revealing ancient hatred beneath her composed exterior. "Those who reach too high must be brought low. Those who steal what isn't theirs must be marked." She was speaking of something beyond Amber's scarred face, something tied to the truth Agnes had revealed. "I don't understand," Amber said, feigning confusion. Judith's smile returned, the mask slipping back into place. "It doesn't matter. By this time tomorrow you'll be on your way to Northridge, and this chapter of Westland's history will be closed forever." After the Countess departed, Amber pressed her hand against the medallion, which gradually cooled. Its protection had worked. Judith had sensed something different, but couldn't identify what had changed. Amber moved to her writing desk, pulling out parchment and ink. If Joshua wasn't coming, she would have to act alone. The vial Agnes had given her was hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box. She had the sleeping potion, the medallion, and now she needed a plan. She began writing, working late into the night. Dawn broke cold and gray, fitting weather for what the kingdom celebrated as a joyous occasion. Servants bustled about, dressing Amber in layers of expensive fabric, arranging her hair, applying powders to minimize the appearance of her scars. Throughout the preparations, she remained eerily calm. The maids whispered among themselves, concerned by her detachment, but Amber barely heard them. Her mind was focused on the folded parchment hidden in her sleeve and the vial concealed within her bodice. When the final touches were complete, she stood before the mirror, looking every inch the royal bride. Only her eyes betrayed the truth, calculating, watchful, waiting. "It's time, Your Highness," the head chambermaid announced. "The Duke awaits in the Great Hall." Amber nodded, following the procession of attendants from her chamber. As they descended the grand staircase, she counted the guards, noted their positions, and tracked the movement of servants through the corridors. Details Agnes had taught her to observe over years of seemingly casual lessons. The castle was unusually crowded. Nobles from across Westland had arrived to witness the prestigious union. This worked in her favor. More people meant more confusion, more opportunities. At the entrance to the Great Hall, King Harold waited to escort her down the aisle. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her. perhaps surprised by how regal she appeared, despite, or because of, her solemn expression. "You look appropriate," he said stiffly. "Thank you, Father," she replied, the title bitter on her tongue. Now that she knew the truth, he offered his arm. As they prepared to enter, Amber made her move. "I feel faint," she whispered, swaying deliberately. "Please, a moment." Harold frowned but signaled the musicians to delay. "Quickly, everyone is waiting." "Water," she gasped, pressing a hand to her forehead, "and my tonic, in my chambers, for my nerves." A young servant girl was dispatched to fetch both when she returned. Amber took the cup with trembling hands, a performance that was only partly feigned. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she removed the vial from her bodice, while pretending to adjust her headdress. "Turn around," she commanded the girl. "My headdress is crooked." As the servant obeyed, Amber poured the contents of Agnes's vial into the water, then quickly hid the empty container. "Thank you," she said, raising the cup to her lips. Inside the great hall, the Duke shifted impatiently on his feet. The assembled nobles murmured among themselves at the delay. Countess Judith, standing near the front, watched the entrance with narrowed eyes. Amber drank deeply, then handed the empty cup back to the servant. She took a single step toward the hall's entrance, then staggered. Her vision blurred exactly as Agnes had warned it would. She felt her knees buckling. "Father," she gasped, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Something's wrong. I can't—" Then she collapsed, her body hitting the stone floor with a convincing thud. The last thing she heard before consciousness faded was Harold's alarmed shout and the panicked cries of the wedding guests. "Poison!" the Duke bellowed, his rheumy eyes wild with fury. "Someone has poisoned my bride." The great hall had erupted into chaos. Guards rushed to secure the castle while physicians examined the princess's still form on a table hastily cleared of wedding gifts. "She lives, but barely," the chief physician announced, her pulses thread-faint, her breathing nearly imperceptible. King Harold stood ashen-faced beside his daughter's body. "How could this happen? Who would dare?" Countess Judith moved silently to his side. "East Haven," she whispered. "Prince Joshua was denied her hand and chose to ensure no one else would have her." The Duke pounded his fist on the table. "I want the prince's head. I want war. We have no proof," Harold cautioned, though rage colored his features. "Then find proof," the Duke demanded. "And until you do, the wedding is postponed, not canceled. If she lives, she's still mine by contract." Servants carried Amber's seemingly lifeless body to her chambers, where physicians continued their futile attempts to revive her. Inside, though her body appeared dead to all examinations, her mind remained partially aware, floating in a strange twilight state, just as Agnes had described. Night fell over Westland Castle. Doubled guards patrolled the walls, their torches creating moving shadows across the courtyard. Inside Amber's chambers, a single physician kept vigil beside her bed, recording her unchanged condition hourly. When midnight struck, he stepped out briefly to deliver his report to the king. In that moment, a cloaked figure slipped through the window, moving with practiced silence across the chamber. Gloved hands carefully lifted Amber's rigid form. "I've got you," Prince Joshua whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Just as your nurse said you would be." With surprising strength, he secured her body over his shoulder and retraced his path to the window, where a rope system waited to lower them safely to the ground. Below, Captain Elliot and 3 loyal knights kept watch, having neutralized, but not killed, the guards in this section of the wall. "Hurry!" Elliot hissed when Joshua reached the ground with his precious cargo. "The guard changes in 15 minutes." They moved through shadows toward the postern gate where horses waited. Saddled and ready, Joshua placed Amber's rigid form carefully across his mount, securing her with leather straps. "The border chapel," Elliot confirmed, eyes constantly scanning for danger. Joshua nodded. As the queen instructed, "We need to reach it before dawn." They rode hard into the night, away from Westland Castle, and the fury that would erupt when morning revealed the princess was gone. Behind them, in the countess's tower, Judith sat before a black mirror, her fingers tracing patterns in the air. Something had awakened her from a deep sleep, a disturbance in the magic that bound the princess to her curse. "Impossible," she whispered as images formed in the obsidian surface. The girl was nearly dead, but the mirror showed her the truth. Riders fleeing through the darkness, carrying a body that by all appearances was lifeless. Yet the magical threads that Judith had woven 20 years ago were stretching, not breaking, as they should if her victim had truly died. "Guards!" she screamed, flinging open her chamber door. "To the king! The princess has been taken." The ancient chapel rose from the mist like a specter, its crumbling stone walls half reclaimed by nature. Situated precisely on the border between Westland and East Haven, it belonged to both kingdoms, and neither, a relic from a time before their division. Dawn light filtered through broken stained glass. Casting multicolored patterns across the leaf-strewn floor, Joshua dismounted, carefully lifting Amber's rigid form from his horse. For 3 days, they had evaded Harold's search parties, taking shelter in caves and abandoned woodcutters' huts, traveling only by night. Now they had reached their destination. With precious little time to spare, "She hasn't moved or shown any sign of waking," he told Captain Elliot, concern etching his features. The nurse said the potion would last 3 days at most. Elliot surveyed the ruins warily. The Queen's instructions were clear. Bring the princess here before the 3rd sunrise after her death. That's today. They carried Amber inside the chapel, laying her gently on a stone altar that remained intact at the center of the nave. Joshua brushed away accumulated leaves and debris, making the surface as clean as possible before placing her upon it. In death-like sleep, Amber looked eerily peaceful. The scars on her face seemed less pronounced in the dappled light, and Joshua found himself studying the features he had come to adore during their riverside meetings. "Come back to me," he whispered, taking her cold hand in his. "Your Highness," Elliot called from the chapel entrance. Riders approaching from the east. Joshua tensed, reaching for his sword. "Westland forces." "No," Elliot replied, his voice tinged with relief. "It's the Queen." Queen Dowager Madeline arrived with a small escort of women in gray cloaks, the same mysterious group that had accompanied her to the council meeting. They dismounted with fluid grace, moving with the confident precision of those thoroughly trained in some unspoken discipline. Madeline entered the chapel first, her normally reserved demeanor replaced by urgency. She moved directly to the altar, placing her hands on either side of Amber's face. "Just in time," she murmured. "The potion is at its limit." Joshua watched as his mother removed a small vial from her robes, uncorking it with practiced ease. "What is that?" "The antidote," she replied, carefully administering 3 drops between Amber's lips. Agnes couldn't include it with the sleeping potion. Too dangerous if discovered together. "Agnes, you've been in contact with Princess Amber's nurse." Madeline's eyes flickered to his, then away, for longer than you know. Before Joshua could press further, a commotion outside drew their attention. Elliot burst through the chapel doors. "Westland soldiers," he reported grimly. "At least 20, coming fast from the west. They've found us." Joshua drew his sword. "How much time do we need for the antidote to work?" "Minutes only," Madeline replied. "But we must keep them away from her, until she wakes fully." The cloaked women moved into defensive positions throughout the chapel without needing instruction. From beneath their gray robes, they produced slender blades that gleamed with an unusual blue-tinged metal. "Who are they?" Joshua asked, startled by their martial readiness. "The last guardians of the Border Covenant," his mother answered. "An order older than both our kingdoms now. Defend the entrance while I complete the ritual." Joshua joined Elliot and his knights at the chapel doors, forming a barrier against the approaching Westland forces. Through the broken archway, he could see dust rising from galloping horses less than a half-mile away. Behind him, Madeline and 2 of the gray-cloaked women began an unusual ceremony. They positioned themselves around Amber, hands extended but not touching her, voices raised in a chant that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The medallion at Amber's throat began to glow with a soft golden light. Outside, King Harold's forces arrived in a thunder of hooves, led by a commander in royal livery. Behind him rode the Countess Judith, her crimson dress stark against her black mount. "Surrender the princess!" the commander shouted. By order of King Harold of Westland," Joshua stepped forward. "The princess is under my protection. She will decide her own fate when she wakes." "Traitor!" Judith spurred her horse forward. "You've poisoned her and stolen her from her rightful husband." "The only poison here," Joshua replied evenly, "is the lies you've fed her since childhood, Countess." Judith's expression darkened. "Kill them all," she ordered the soldiers. "Retrieve the princess," the Westland forces charged. Joshua and his men braced for impact, swords ready, though they were outnumbered nearly 3 to 1. But as the first soldiers reached the chapel threshold, an invisible barrier flared to life with blinding intensity. Men and horses recoiled as if struck. confusion rippling through their ranks. "Protection magic," Judith hissed, recognizing the phenomenon. The old kind. Inside the chapel, the chanting grew louder. The medallion at Amber's throat pulsed with light that spread to encompass her entire body. Her back arched suddenly, a gasp escaping her lips as color returned to her face. Joshua wanted desperately to rush to her side, but held his position at the door, preventing any Westland soldier brave enough to test the barrier from entering. Amber's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as she took in her surroundings. "Joshua," she whispered, her voice weak from disuse. "I'm here," he called back without leaving his post. "You're safe. We're at the border chapel, as Agnes instructed." She struggled to sit up, assisted by Madeline. Recognition dawned in her eyes as she looked at the Queen Dowager. You're my aunt. My mother's sister." Madeline nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, child. I've waited 20 years for this moment." Outside, Judith dismounted, approaching the invisible barrier with raised hands. Strange symbols appeared in the air where her fingers traced patterns, glowing with sickly green light. "She's attempting to break the protection," one of the gray-cloaked women warned. Amber slid from the altar, standing on unsteady legs. "The medallion," she said to Madeline. "Agnes said it would help break the curse here, in this place." "Yes, but you need to be at full strength," Madeline cautioned. "The sleeping potion has weakened you. There's no time." Amber moved toward the chapel entrance, the medallion still glowing against her chest. "She's coming through." Indeed, the barrier was visibly weakening where Judith worked her counterspell. Cracks of green light spread like fissures across the invisible shield. Joshua and his men readied themselves for the physical confrontation that would follow once it fell. "Stand aside, boy," Judith called to Joshua. "This doesn't concern you. It's between me and the so-called princess." "You cursed me," Amber said, her voice gaining strength as she approached. "You marked me to hide my true identity." A ripple of confusion passed through the Westland soldiers. Several exchanged uncertain glances, clearly hearing information that contradicted what they'd been told. Judith laughed, a chilling sound. "Clever girl. Finally figured it out, did you?" Too late to matter. With a final gesture, she shattered the barrier. Green light exploded outward as the protection spell collapsed. Joshua and his men formed a tight defensive line, but Judith simply raised her hand. An invisible force flung them aside like rag dolls, clearing her path to Amber. "I should have killed you as a baby," Judith said, advancing into the chapel. "But using you as Harold's shame was so much more poetic." Amber stood her ground, the medallion at her throat pulsing brighter. "Who am I? Tell them all the truth." Judith's gaze swept the gathered soldiers, many of whom had served the Westland royal family for generations. Their confused loyalty was evident in their hesitation. "You are nothing," Judith spat. "A remnant of a bloodline that should have ended 20 years ago when Harold took what was rightfully his." "My parents," Amber pressed. "Tell them who they were." The air between them seemed to thicken with tension. Outside, more riders appeared on the horizon. Reinforcements from East Haven, Joshua realized with relief. Judith's face contorted with hatred. "Your mother was Eleanor of Westland, rightful queen before Harold's coup. Your father was Prince Rowan, Harold's cousin and the true heir." Her voice dripped with venom. "And now you'll join them in death." She lunged forward, fingers curved like claws, dark energy crackling around her hands. Amber raised the medallion, which flared with golden light at the precise moment Judith's spell struck. The two magics collided in an explosion of light and sound that shook the ancient chapel to its foundations. Golden light erupted from Amber's medallion, colliding with Judith's dark magic in a blinding explosion. The shockwave knocked everyone backward, everyone except Amber herself, who remained standing as if anchored to the stone floor. The medallion burned against her skin, not painfully, but with a warmth that spread through her entire body. Judith recovered first, her face contorted with fury. "Impossible. That trinket cannot counter my magic." "It's not the medallion alone," Queen Madeline said, regaining her footing. "It's the place, and the blood, and the timing." Joshua pushed himself up, shielding his eyes against the pulsing light that now surrounded Amber. "What's happening to her?" No one answered as Amber herself began to change. The scars on her face, those marks that had defined her existence for so long, began to glow with the same golden light as the medallion. She raised trembling fingers to her cheek, feeling the ridges that had been both her shame and her protection growing warm beneath her touch. "No!" Judith shrieked, flinging another spell toward Amber. This time, the magic bounced harmlessly off the golden aura, rebounding toward its caster. Judith barely dodged her own dark energy, which scorched the chapel wall behind her. Outside, the arriving East Haven forces surrounded the Westland soldiers, who seemed increasingly uncertain of their mission. The revelation of Amber's true parentage had created visible doubt among their ranks. "Arrest them all," Judith commanded the Westland captain. "They've kidnapped the princess and bewitched her." The captain hesitated, looking from Judith to Amber, whose transformation was visible even from a distance. "My lady, something isn't right here. The princess doesn't appear to be under duress." "She's enchanted, you fool," Judith spat. Inside the chapel, Amber felt a strange certainty growing within her. The medallion wasn't just protecting her, it was guiding her. Knowledge she couldn't possibly possess flowed into her mind. Ancient words, ceremonial gestures, the weight of traditions stretching back generations. "Joshua," she called, her voice resonating with newfound power. "Come to me." He moved to her side without hesitation, drawn by something beyond conscious thought. When he took her outstretched hand, the golden light enveloped him as well. "What is this?" he asked in wonder. "A completion," Madeline said softly. "The union that was always meant to be." The gray-cloaked women formed a circle around them, their hands linked. The oldest among them spoke in a clear voice that carried beyond the chapel walls. "Witness the fulfillment of the border covenant. The bloodlines reunite, as was foretold when the kingdoms were first divided, Eastland and Westland, separated by conflict, united by blood." Judith howled in rage, unleashing a barrage of dark magic that crashed against the barrier of light surrounding the circle. "I will not be undone by children playing at rituals they don't understand." But her attacks were futile. With each spell she cast, the golden light grew stronger, and Judith herself seemed to weaken. Amber turned to Joshua, her eyes reflecting the supernatural glow around them. "We need to complete the ceremony. Now, the words are in my mind. I think they're coming from the medallion, from my ancestors. Tell me what to do," he said simply. She guided him to stand opposite her at the ancient altar. The medallion floated up from her chest, suspended in the air between them. Its chain lengthened impossibly, encircling both their wrists, binding them together. "Repeat after me," she instructed, then began speaking in a language Joshua didn't recognize but somehow understood, the ancient tongue of both their kingdoms before division. As they recited the words together, the scars on Amber's face began to change. The golden light concentrated there, growing almost too bright to look at directly. Pain and pleasure mingled in her expression, as something fundamental shifted beneath her skin. Outside, the standoff between the two kingdoms' forces dissolved into astonished observation. Even Judith's most loyal supporters couldn't tear their eyes away from the supernatural display unfolding in the ruined chapel. "It's the old magic," whispered one grizzled Westland veteran. "My grandmother spoke of it, from before the kingdoms split." Captain Elliot seized the opportunity, addressing both forces. "Soldiers of Westland, what you witness is the truth long hidden. Princess Amber is the rightful heir to your throne, daughter of Prince Rowan and Princess Eleanor, murdered by Harold and the Countess 20 years ago." A murmur ran through the Westland troops. Many were old enough to remember the beloved Prince Rowan and the suspicious circumstances of his death. Inside the circle of golden light, the ceremony reached its crescendo. The medallion between Amber and Joshua pulsed with each word they spoke, the ancient language flowing more naturally from their lips with each passing moment. "Join hands above the medallion," instructed one of the gray-cloaked women. As their fingers intertwined over the glowing talisman, the light reached blinding intensity. Amber felt the familiar burning in her scarred cheek transform into a sensation of ice, then warmth, then nothing at all. The medallion itself seemed to dissolve into pure light, absorbed into both their bodies simultaneously. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural display ended. The golden light receded, drawing back into Amber and Joshua like water into sand, leaving only a faint glow surrounding them both. In the sudden dimness, all eyes fixed on Amber's face, where the crescent-shaped scars had marred her features since childhood. Smooth, unblemished skin now remained. The curse was broken, but the transformation went beyond the physical. Her entire countenance had changed, revealing a striking resemblance to the portrait in the medallion, and to Queen Madeline herself. No one who saw her now could doubt her lineage. "Impossible," Judith whispered, her composure cracking as she beheld the living proof of her failed magic. Taking advantage of the Countess's shock, two of the gray-cloaked women seized her arms, preventing another magical attack. Judith struggled futilely against their surprisingly strong grip. "How does it feel?" Amber asked, approaching her captor turned captive. "To see 20 years of scheming undone in a moment." Judith's face twisted with hatred. "This proves nothing. A parlor trick. A glamour." "The soldiers see the truth," Joshua interrupted, joining Amber. "Look at their faces." Indeed, the Westland forces had lowered their weapons, many dropping to one knee in spontaneous recognition of their true sovereign. The captain who had hesitated earlier now approached, his helmet removed and head bowed. "Your Highness," he addressed Amber, "I served your father, Prince Rowan, before the usurpation. The resemblance is undeniable." He knelt formally. "My sword is yours, if you will have it." "Traitors!" Judith shrieked. "Harold will have you all executed." "Harold isn't here," Amber observed. "Curious, isn't it? He sent his soldiers and his witch, but wouldn't risk himself. He knows," Madeline said quietly. "He's always known this day might come. That's why he kept you alive but hidden. Why he arranged the marriage to remove you permanently from Westland." She approached her niece, touching her now flawless cheek with gentle fingers. "You look so much like your mother now." Joshua found himself staring at Amber's transformed face. The scars had never mattered to him. He had seen beyond them to the person beneath, but witnessing her true appearance, unmarred by Judith's curse, was like seeing a long-hidden truth finally revealed. "What happens now?" he asked, addressing both Amber and his mother. Before either could answer, a Westland soldier galloped up from the direction of the castle. "Your Majesty," he called, addressing the captain rather than Amber. "King Harold has fled. When news reached him of the confrontation here, he took his personal guard and rode north toward the Duke of Northridge's lands." A ripple of surprise passed through both forces. Harold's flight was as good as a confession. No legitimate king would abandon his castle at the first sign of trouble. Amber turned to face the assembled soldiers of both kingdoms, standing tall despite her exhaustion. The ceremonial joining with Joshua had given her strength she didn't know she possessed, and knowledge that felt ancient and familiar all at once. "Soldiers of Westland," she called, her voice carrying with newfound authority. "I make you this promise. I will not seek vengeance for past wrongs, but justice for our future. Those who serve honorably will find honor returned. Those who swear loyalty will receive loyalty in kind." She extended her hand to Joshua, who took it without hesitation. "And I promise something more. An end to the division between our kingdoms. What was sundered will be rejoined." As the rising sun fully illuminated the ancient chapel, its light caught the subtle golden glow that still surrounded the joined hands of Westland's rightful queen and East Haven's crown prince, a visible symbol of the union that would heal decades of hatred and unite two kingdoms into one. The journey back to Westland Castle took on the atmosphere of a triumphant procession, rather than a military march. Soldiers from both kingdoms rode side by side, their previous enmity dissolved by the revelations at the chapel and the undeniable power they had witnessed. Amber and Joshua rode at the front, flanked by Queen Madeline and the gray-cloaked guardians. Countess Judith followed under heavy guard, her hands bound with special shackles inscribed with symbols that prevented her from accessing her dark magic. Her once proud bearing had crumbled, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare that occasionally flashed with impotent rage. As they approached the castle gates, Agnes waited on the road, her weathered face breaking into a smile at the sight of Amber's transformation. When Amber dismounted to embrace her old nurse, many soldiers were moved to tears by the reunion. "You did it," Agnes whispered. "You found your true self, thanks to you," Amber replied. "You kept me alive all these years." Agnes shook her head. "I merely preserved what was precious until the right time. The strength was always yours." The castle staff gathered in the courtyard, murmuring in astonishment at Amber's changed appearance and the unusual alliance of Westland and East Haven forces. Rumors had already spread of Harold's flight and the magical confrontation at the border chapel. In the great hall, Amber ascended the steps to the throne but did not sit. Instead, she turned to address the assembled nobles, soldiers, and servants. "For 20 years, a lie has ruled this kingdom," she began, her voice steady. "Today, that lie ends." She recounted the truth that Agnes and Madeline had revealed, how Harold had orchestrated the deaths of her parents, the rightful rulers of Westland, when she was just an infant, how Agnes had saved her from death, only for Judith to mark her with the curse that had both disfigured and concealed her true identity. Harold raised me not out of kinship or compassion, Amber explained, but as a living trophy of his victory, hidden away where my very existence reinforced his supposed legitimacy while ensuring I would never be recognized as the true heir. From the crowd, the elderly Lord Marshal stepped forward. I served your father, Prince Rowan, and had my doubts about his death from the beginning, but without proof, his voice broke. Looking at you now, there is no doubt. You have your father's eyes and your mother's spirit. One by one, the old guard who had served under her parents came forward to pledge fealty. Even those nobles who had prospered under Harold's rule could not deny the evidence before them, especially with Harold's damning flight. Joshua joined Amber by the throne, standing supportively at her side without overstepping. What of Harold? He asked. He'll seek allies, possibly raise an army. Captain Elliot approached, kneeling before them. Your Majesties, scouts report that Harold never reached Northridge. The Duke refused him entry upon learning of the princesses, the Queen's escape and transformation. Pragmatic of him, Madeline observed dryly. The Duke always aligns himself with the winning side. Harold was last seen heading for the eastern wastes, Elliot continued. Few survive there, especially as winter approaches. Amber nodded, feeling no satisfaction in her usurper's desperate flight. Justice often finds its own path, she said. But what of his accomplice? All eyes turned to Judith, who knelt between two guardian women, her head bowed but her eyes burning with hatred. Bring her forward, Amber commanded. The guardians led Judith to the foot of the throne. For a moment, the two women regarded each other in silence, one who had suffered under a curse for 20 years, the other who had cast it out of jealousy and ambition. You were my father's cousin, Amber said. Why such hatred for his family? Judith's lips curled in contempt. Your mother stole what should have been mine. Harold promised me the throne in exchange for helping him take power. And your magic, where did that come from? The same place yours did, Judith spat. From the old bloodlines. But while your family squandered the gift on healing and protection, I learned its true potential. Agnes stepped forward, her eyes flashing with rare anger. You perverted the ancient ways, Judith. The women of our line were never meant to use their gifts for dominion. What shall we do with her? Joshua asked. Amber considered the woman who had caused so much suffering. The crowd clearly expected execution, but something within her, perhaps the ancient knowledge awakened by the medallion, suggested another path. Countess Judith, she pronounced, your punishment shall match your crime. The magic you twisted to curse me shall be bound within you forever, unable to be released. You will live out your days in the North Tower, with all the comforts befitting your station, but no power beyond those walls. Judith laughed bitterly. You think that's mercy? A gilded cage is still a cage. It isn't mercy, Amber replied evenly. It's justice. You'll have years to reflect on what your ambition cost you, just as I had years to live with the scars you gave me. As Judith was led away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The shackles that bound her magic would become permanent enchantments, crafted by the guardians to ensure she could never again wield the power she had so misused. With the immediate threat contained, attention turned to the future of the two kingdoms. Amber and Joshua stood together before the assembled court, their hands joined in a visible symbol of the union formed at the chapel. The ancient prophecy spoke of divided kingdoms rejoined through blood and choice, Queen Madeleine explained. What began with the marriage of Eleanor and Rowan, before Harold's interference, has been fulfilled through their daughter and my son. We propose a formal reunification, Joshua announced. Not Westland absorbing East Haven, nor the reverse, but a true union of equals, one kingdom, as it was in the beginning. The proposal met with approval from most quarters, though some nobles from both kingdoms expressed concerns about governance and distribution of power. Amber and Joshua patiently addressed each question, demonstrating a unified vision that impressed even the skeptics. As discussions continued into the evening, Amber slipped away to the quiet of the garden terrace. The events of the past days had left her little time to process her complete transformation, not just the removal of her scars, but the discovery of her true identity and the awakening of abilities she was only beginning to understand. Joshua found her there, gazing at the stars emerging in the twilight sky. Are you all right? He asked, joining her at the stone balustrade. I'm not sure, she admitted. For 20 years I was the scarred princess, hidden away and deemed unworthy. Now I'm supposedly a queen with magical bloodline and the rightful ruler of Westland. She touched her smooth cheek, still marveling at the absence of the familiar ridges. "Who am I, truly?" "You're the same person you were by the river," Joshua said simply. "The woman who didn't hesitate to save a drowning child, who discussed philosophy and justice with a stranger, who dreamed of a better world." He took her hand gently. "The scars didn't define you then, and their absence doesn't define you now." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "When did you know that you loved me? I mean, when you argued that true nobility comes from actions, not birth," he replied without hesitation. "You spoke with such conviction, despite believing yourself merely a merchant's assistant speaking to a squire. And now we're to rule a united kingdom." She marveled. "Do you think we're ready? Together?" He smiled. "I believe we can face anything." As they sealed this promise with a kiss, the last light of sunset illuminated the castle walls in golden hues. Below in the courtyard, soldiers who had been enemies that morning now shared meals and stories, while in the council chamber, nobles from both kingdoms drafted the first documents of reunification. The road ahead would not be easy. Harold remained at large, likely seeking foreign allies to help him reclaim his stolen throne. Centuries of division between the kingdoms wouldn't be healed overnight, and Amber still had much to learn about her heritage and the magical abilities that were her birthright. But as she stood in Joshua's embrace, watching night settle over what would soon be their united kingdom, Amber felt a certainty that transcended the challenges ahead. The medallion's magic had awakened something ancient within her, a connection to generations of strong women who had preserved their knowledge through centuries of male dominance and suspicion. "We'll build something new," she promised softly, "not just uniting kingdoms, but restoring balance between men and women, between power and wisdom, between the old ways and the new." As stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, their light seemed to echo the promise of a new dawn for the once divided lands, and for the princess who had discovered her true face and her destined path.